The story of João Cândido Felisberto does not begin on the decks of a warship or in the tense hours of a naval revolt. It begins far from the sea, in the quiet, dusty countryside of southern Brazil, where the wind carries memories older than the Republic itself. It begins on June 24, 1880. In Cruzilhada do Sul, in a land still stained by the shadows of slavery. Joe was born the son of former enslaved parents who carried both the scars and the pride of survival. His childhood unfolded in a Brazil that had abolished slavery only on paper. The chains had been removed. Yes, but the world around him was still built on hierarchies that said men like him should know their place, and that place was never at the helm of anything. From an early age, Joe learned something that would shape his entire life. Freedom is not given, it is fought for. He grew up surrounded by stories of endurance, by families trying to rebuild their dignity after centuries of captivity. He learned to work with his hands before he learned to dream. And yet somehow, life had prepared him for something far bigger than the horizon of that rural world. By age 14, Joe left home and moved to Porto Alegre searching for opportunity. He found the arsenal of the Brazilian Navy, one of the few doors open to a poor black boy at the end of the 19th century. The Navy was a strict hierarchical world, but it promised a steady life, meals, a uniform, and, above all, a future. To Joe, that was enough. He joined as an apprentice, quiet but observant, learning quickly, absorbing everything. The officers noticed his discipline. His fellow sailors noticed his calm strength, and the sea, vast, indifferent, humbling, began to shape him. But the Navy Joe entered was a contradiction. Brazil was building modern battleships, the pride of a young republic eager to show power on the world stage. Yet inside those modern hulls lived the practices of a centuries-old past. Most officers were white, from wealthy families. Most sailors were black or mixed-race men from the poorest corners of the country. And discipline was enforced not with honor, but with violence, especially the lash. Yes, the lash. In 1895. In 1900, in the dawn of a new century, the Brazilian Navy still whipped men like slaves. Joe saw everything: the humiliation, the beatings, the unequal punishments, the cold detachment of officers who believed their subordinates were born to obey and to suffer. Still, he persisted. He was promoted. He became a skilled helmsman, admired for his precision and composure. He found brotherhood among the sailors, men who, like him, worked hard and endured quietly. But the moment that changed Joe's life forever came in 1909, when he was sent to England to help bring home one of the most advanced warships in the world, the battleship Minas. It was in England that Joe saw something he had never seen before: a navy without whips, a navy where sailors were disciplined but respected, a navy where men of all backgrounds worked with dignity, not fear, a navy that treated its crew as human beings. This revelation struck him harder than any lash ever could. When he returned to Brazil in 1910, he returned a different man. The contrast was unbearable. Modern ships, yes, but the same old cruelty, the same racism, the same humiliation, the same lash cutting into the backs of black sailors who had just risked their lives bringing home those new steel giants. And then came the breaking point. In November 1910, a sailor named Marcelino Rodrigues Menezes received an unimaginable punishment: 250 lashes, 250, a number that belonged to the darkest days of slavery. Menezes collapsed, his flesh shredded, his screams echoing across the ship like a final warning. Every sailor who watched felt something inside them snap. Enough. The Navy had pushed too far. The Republic had betrayed its own promise. The officers had mistaken obedience for submission. And the sailors, the men who kept those powerful warships alive, reached a conclusion no one in power expected. The time for silence was over. As the days passed, Joe became the center of quiet, urgent conversations among the crew. Not because he sought leadership, not because he shouted, but because he was calm, clear-minded, trusted, the kind of man sailors follow not out of fear, but out of respect. And then, on the night of November 22, 1910, history unfolded. The sailors seized control of the battleships Minas Gerais, São Paulo, Bahia, and Deodoro. They locked out the officers. They positioned themselves at the guns. And by sunrise, the unthinkable had happened. The most powerful naval fleet in South America was no longer under the command of the Brazilian government. It was under the command of the men it had spent decades abusing. The sailors did not want bloodshed. They wanted dignity. They wanted the lash abolished. They wanted better food, fair pay, humane treatment. They wanted to be treated as men. Under the tense morning light, newspapers in Rio began reporting the impossible. Politicians panicked. Officers ranted in disbelief. And the people, the ordinary people of Rio, began to whisper a name that would soon become legend: João Cândido, the Black Admiral. He wasn't an admiral, not officially, but in that moment, he commanded the most powerful ships Brazil had ever built. And he did it not for glory, not for revenge, but for justice. For a brief moment, it seemed the sailors had won. Congress promised reforms, the president promised amnesty. The lash was abolished. It should have been a victory that changed the course of the country. But power rarely forgives humiliation. And what João did not yet know, what no sailor on those ships could imagine, was that the celebration would be short-lived. The Navy was preparing something cold, hidden, and merciless, a counterstrike, a betrayal, a punishment far worse than whips, a punishment waiting in the shadows. For 4 tense days, the Brazilian government found itself standing on the edge of a cliff. On one side, the might of its own modern navy, now in the hands of the sailors. On the other, the unbearable fear of losing control of the capital, the prestige of the nation, and perhaps the young republic itself. While cannons pointed at Rio de Janeiro, João Cândido held the kind of power no black man in Brazil had ever held before. Power not born from violence, but from moral clarity, from dignity, from the courage of someone who understood the weight of every decision he made. He could have ordered fire. He never did. He could have used the guns to take the city. He refused, because this was never a revolt for destruction. It was a revolt for humanity. And it was exactly that humanity, that refusal to act with the brutality that had been used against them, that won the sailors the sympathy of the people. Newspapers began to change their tone. Citizens gathered near the docks, whispering, almost in awe, about the discipline and calm of the men controlling the battleships. Politicians, pressured by the public, scrambled to negotiate, and eventually, the government relented. The lash would be abolished. The sailors would receive amnesty. The demands would be met. The revolt seemed resolved. The city exhaled. Families slept in peace again. The cannons lowered, and João Cândido, who had commanded the fleet without firing a single shot, breathed with the relief of someone who believed justice had prevailed. But power, when humiliated, rarely forgives. Behind closed doors, away from the press, away from Congress, away from the people who had celebrated the end of the revolt, the high ranks of the Navy vowed revenge. Not immediate revenge, not public revenge, something quieter, something buried. A punishment that would erase the revolt, erase the victory, erase the memory of the black men who dared to confront the institution. While João and the sailors returned to their duties, believing the Republic had honored its word, the Navy began writing the opposite story. Men who had once been praised for their discipline were suddenly labeled dangerous. Mariners who had been promised amnesty found themselves monitored, reprimanded, isolated. The officers refused to salute them, refused to acknowledge them, refused even to look at them. And João, the man the newspapers had called the Black Admiral, became the biggest target of all. He had not raised his voice, he had not threatened the officers, he had not even fired a gun. But he had done something unforgivable. He had shown the country that the oppressed could think, could organize, could lead. He had revealed the Navy's brutality to the world. He had shattered the illusion of a modern institution. He had proven that power built on humiliation was fragile. And for that, he had to be destroyed. Weeks passed. The public moved on. The newspapers turned their attention to politics, to scandals, to foreign affairs. But inside the Navy, the storm was only beginning. Then came the perfect pretext. In early December 1910, only days after the end of the revolt, a small, disorganized mutiny broke out on an older ship. It had nothing to do with the revolt. It was contained almost immediately. But to the Navy's high command, it was a golden opportunity, a chance to rewrite the narrative, a chance to claim that the sailors were still a threat, a chance to unleash the punishment they had already decided upon. Dozens of sailors were arrested, and among them, without evidence, without charges, without justification, was João Cândido. He was dragged from the deck and taken to the prison on Ilha das Cobras, not as a hero, not as a symbol of justice, but as a threat. The sailors who had trusted the amnesty watched in shock. The promises of the Republic evaporated like mist on the bay. João was thrown into a dark, airless cell along with several other sailors, a place not meant for living men, a place where the walls sweated humidity and despair, a place that smelled of mold, rust, and slow death. For the Navy, the goal was simple: break him, break the backbone of the revolt, break the symbol, break the man. Prison guards taunted the sailors, officers interrogated them brutally. Some demanded confessions for crimes they hadn't committed. Others simply wanted to see fear in their eyes. But João remained calm even there, even then, even surrounded by the violence of a system determined to crush him. His calmness enraged the officers, because nothing infuriates the oppressor more than the serenity of a man they cannot intimidate. Then came Christmas Eve, 1910, while families in Rio prepared their dinners and exchanged gifts. A group of guards walked down the corridor of the prison, carrying buckets of quicklime, a chemical that, when mixed with sweat and moisture, releases lethal burning fumes. They sealed the sailors inside the cell, blocked the tiny openings, and dumped the quicklime onto the floor. The cell filled with suffocating gas. Men screamed. Some clawed at the walls. Others collapsed. Their lungs burned. Their skin blistered. Their eyes flooded with tears. It was not a punishment. It was an execution. When the guards opened the cell the next morning, 16 sailors lay dead, their bodies twisted by agony, their mouths stained with foam, their lungs scorched. Only 2 survived. One of them was João Cândido. The Navy had tried to kill him, but he lived. Not because the institution wanted him alive, but because history demanded him alive. His survival was not a blessing, it was a burden. It was the beginning of the longest, darkest chapter of his life. He emerged from that cell not as a rebel, not as a hero, but as a man who had seen the true face of the institution he once served. And the Navy, terrified of turning him into a martyr, made a decision. They would not kill him. They would erase him from the records, erase him from the barracks, erase him from the future of the fleet, and worst of all, erase him from the memory of Brazil. But fate had other plans. When João Cândido stepped out of the torture cell on Ilha das Cobras, he did not emerge as the same man who had once stood proudly on the deck of the Minas Gerais. Something inside him had changed, not broken, but transformed. He had looked death in the eyes, felt it in his lungs, smelled it in the burning air of that sealed tomb, and yet, he lived. The Navy didn't celebrate his survival, they resented it. To them, João was no longer a sailor. He was a problem, a symbol they could not kill, a ghost they could not control. And so began a new strategy, not of murder, but of erasure. They removed him from service, stripped him of his uniform, tore away his identity as a naval man. No ceremony, no letter, no explanation. He walked out of the barracks as if he had never existed. Rio de Janeiro did not welcome him back. The same crowds that once whispered his name as a hero now passed him on the streets without recognition. Newspapers, once filled with his image, now ignored him. Politicians who had praised the moral clarity of the sailors during the revolt now looked the other way. The country had gotten everything it wanted from the revolt: no civil war, a sense of moral progress, and the illusion of justice. And now it wanted to forget. João found himself wandering through the city with empty hands and a heavy heart. He searched for work, any work, but each time a door opened, it closed with the same cold words. "We can't hire someone like you. You're a troublemaker. You bring problems. You're the man from the revolt." His name, once a symbol of bravery, had become a curse. He took whatever jobs he could find, carrying boxes at the docks, cleaning boats, pushing carts through the market, doing the kind of labor that leaves your hands raw and your soul exhausted. But even when he found work, it didn't last long. Someone always recognized him. A manager, a foreman, a man in uniform passing by. And the whisper would spread, "That's the Black Admiral." And João would be dismissed. It was not enough for the Navy to expel him. He had to starve, he had to suffer, he had to disappear. The state wanted to make an example of him, not in public, but in silence, so that no other sailor, no other poor man, no other black man would ever dare to rise again. And through all this, João remained the same, calm, dignified, quiet. The same serenity that had angered the officers now carried him through the darkest years of his life. But cruelty does not stop when it is fed. It demands more. Poverty began to suffocate his home. Hunger invaded. And then tragedy struck with a brutality far deeper than any lash the Navy had ever used. His wife fell ill. Then his children. Diseases born from poverty, diseases that flourish where the state refuses to look. João could not save them. He who once commanded the most powerful warships in South America could not protect the people he loved most. One by one they died. His wife, his children, his entire world. If the Navy had not killed him in the prison, life was now slowly trying to finish the job. He buried them with hands hardened by work, and with a heart that refused to break, even when shattered. And the city moved on without noticing. No journalist wrote about it. No official expressed sympathy. No one said his name. Rio is full of ghosts, but few of them walked the streets like João, breathing, working, enduring. When he could, he stood by the water and watched the ships pass, the same ships he once knew so intimately. He felt the salt of the sea, the hum of the engines, the movement of the tides. The Navy had banished him, but it could not take away the ocean. The sea remained his companion. It had watched him rise, it had watched him fall, and now it watched him survive. Years passed, decades. Brazil changed governments, changed presidents, changed uniforms, but João remained on the margins, selling fish at the Praca 15 market, hauling nets, living in a small shack in the outskirts of the city. He became a forgotten chapter, a name mentioned only in whispers, a memory avoided by those who preferred the official version of events. But history has a strange way of protecting those who walk with truth. Every now and then, a young journalist would appear, notebook in hand, asking questions. A historian would knock on his door. A student would sit beside him and ask what really happened in 1910. And João, with the calm voice that had survived the revolt, the torture, the betrayal, and the silence, would tell everything, not to defend himself, not for vengeance, but because truth is the only thing he ever carried. These conversations, humble, quiet, often forgotten, were like small sparks, and over time those sparks began to ignite something larger, a new understanding of the man Brazil had tried to erase. The truth was resurfacing, and once truth rises, it does not sink again. João was no longer simply a survivor. He was becoming something else, something the Navy feared, but history demanded, a symbol of resistance, a symbol of dignity, a symbol of the fight against institutional violence, a symbol of the black struggle in Brazil. And this symbol, long buried by silence, was finally beginning to breathe. As the years rolled into decades, João Cândido became something rare and paradoxical, a man still alive, yet already a ghost in the eyes of the nation he had dared to confront. He walked through markets, through docks, through alleys, carrying baskets of fish or tools in his hands, while around him, life pulsed with the indifference of a city that forgets too quickly. But history is patient, and truth, no matter how deeply buried, has a way of resurfacing. In the quiet corners of academic circles, in conversations whispered between young sailors, and in the songs of the people who felt his struggle without knowing his name, something was stirring. Joe's story, long hidden under layers of denial, began to rise like a tide returning to shore. It started small. A journalist wrote a short article about the forgotten leader of the revolt. A historian questioned the official version of events. A professor retold the story in a classroom, placing Joe not as a traitor but as a hero of human dignity. A samba composer, inspired by fragments of memory, turned his name into melody. Piece by piece, his voice began to echo again. People who had never heard of him started asking questions. Who was the Black Admiral? Why did the Navy erase him? Why was a hero forced to live in misery? What kind of nation punishes the men who fought for justice? These questions began to break the silence that had been built around him. And once the silence cracked, the truth flowed through. For the first time, Joe wasn't just a survivor speaking to isolated visitors. He was becoming the center of a historical reevaluation. Historians revisited naval archives and found contradictions everywhere. Punishments that were supposed to be legal were suddenly exposed as cruelty. The supposed mutinies used to justify the arrests were revealed to be fabricated or exaggerated. The Navy's own documents betrayed the lies that had been repeated for decades. And Joe's calm, humble testimony relayed countless times from his modest home fit perfectly with the new discoveries. The world had changed, and now, finally, Brazil was beginning to change with it. As the second half of the 20th century unfolded, the country entered a period of deep reflection. Movements for democracy gained strength. Activists protested racial inequality. Artists exposed hidden histories. Students demanded truth from institutions built on old hierarchies. In this growing wave of social awakening, Joe's story became impossible to ignore. He was no longer seen as the leader of a mutiny. He was reinterpreted as a symbol of human rights long before that term existed in political vocabulary. He was understood as a black man who confronted an institution that treated black bodies as expendable, even decades after abolition. He was recognized as a leader who refused to use violence even when he had the power to do so. His leadership became a lesson. His calmness became a virtue. His suffering became a testament. And one by one, the pieces of his erased legacy were restored. Books began to include his name. Theaters created plays about him. Documentaries retold the revolt from the sailor's perspective for the first time. Musicians turned his struggle into everlasting rhythm. And slowly, the people began to reclaim Joe as one of their own. He became a hero not because the government said so, but because the people saw themselves in him. Saw their poverty in his poverty. Saw their silence in his silence. Saw their courage in his courage. Saw their hunger for dignity in his refusal to bow. This was the rebirth of João Cândido, not a rebirth orchestrated by the Navy, nor by the state, but by the same people whose voices had been ignored for centuries. It was the rebirth of a man who represented a deeper Brazil, the Brazil of the working class, the Brazil of the black population, the Brazil that fights quietly, survives fiercely, and remembers deeply. By the time Joe was approaching his final years, he was no longer just the fisherman of Proca 15. He was evolving into a symbol larger than the life he had lived in poverty. He watched, with tired eyes and a steady heart, as younger generations approached him with respect instead of suspicion. As journalists finally sought his version of the truth. As historians placed his name where it always belonged, in the center of one of the most important acts of resistance in Brazilian history. He never sought credit. He never asked for recognition. And yet, recognition began to surround him like a rising tide. Joe had once commanded the mightiest ships in South America. Now, he commanded something far more powerful: memory. The same memory the Navy tried to suffocate. The same memory that poverty tried to erase. The same memory that time tried to bury. But memory, when tied to justice, does not die. And as Brazil stepped into a new era, Joe's story transformed from whispered recollection to undeniable truth. He was a man who survived a system built to destroy him. A man who fought for dignity when the world denied him dignity. A man who led with conscience rather than fear. A man who refused violence even when holding the power of warships in his hands. A man ahead of his time, so far ahead that it took Brazil nearly a century to catch up. And as he aged, poor but unbroken, Joe bore witness to the slow awakening of a nation finally ready to confront its own wounds. A nation finally ready to see him. By the time the memory of João Cândido began to stir in the collective conscience of Brazil, he was already an old man, thin, weathered, but still carrying in his eyes the calm dignity of someone who had endured the unendurable and refused to let bitterness reshape him. He had lived long enough to watch the world change. He had watched dictatorships rise and fall. He had watched technologies transform the seas he once navigated. He had watched young men in crisp white uniforms walk past him, unaware that the old fisherman selling his daily catch was the same man who had once commanded the most powerful battleships of their nation. History had erased him, but time slowly, steadily was beginning to correct the mistake. The silence surrounding the revolt of the Lash was no longer sustainable. Brazil could not pretend to be a modern, democratic nation while burying its most painful truths. And when scholars and artists started unearthing those truths, the story that emerged was not just of a mutiny, but of a moral stand against a leftover relic of slavery. The more people learned, the more impossible it became to ignore the brutal injustice committed against João and his fellow sailors. And as the debate grew, something extraordinary happened. The image of João Cândido began to transform from the ghost the Navy tried to hide into a figure too powerful to forget. In university lectures, his name was spoken with respect. In social movements, it was spoken with pride. In artistic communities, it was spoken with wonder. He was no longer the rebel sailor. He was becoming the man who stood for human dignity. Historians revisited the revolt not as an act of treason, but as a courageous call for basic rights, a call far ahead of its time. They exposed the racial dynamics hidden beneath the official narrative. They highlighted how the Navy's discipline rested on the same violence that slavery had institutionalized. And in every one of these revelations, João stood at the center. It was impossible to ignore how he had handled himself during the revolt without cruelty, without bloodshed, without losing control of the ships, without letting the rage of centuries of oppression turn into chaos. He led with conscience, with restraint, with the kind of moral clarity that only appears in moments when the world insists on denying someone's humanity. As this truth resurfaced, João became more than a historical character. He became a representation of the Brazil that lives in silence, the Brazil of the oppressed, the forgotten, the overlooked. People saw their own struggles reflected in his. Workers saw their exploitation in his exploitation. Black Brazilians saw their resilience in his resilience. Sailors saw their pride in his discipline. And the poor saw their daily fight for dignity in his unbreakable calm. And it wasn't only the intellectuals or the activists who revived him. The arts embraced him. Samba, the rhythm born from Afro-Brazilian resistance, carried Joe's name like a drumbeat. Songs honored him not as a victim, but as a symbol of endurance. Playwrights staged his story, illuminating truths the government had tried to hide. Filmmakers reconstructed moments of his life with reverence and rage. Painters immortalized his face, sharp features, stern eyes, a mixture of sorrow and strength. The public began to see João as one of those rare figures who seem larger than their own history, a man whose life tells us more about a country's soul than any official decree ever could. Yet, even as recognition grew, João still lived in poverty. He still sold fish at the market. He still lived in a modest shack in the outskirts of Rio. He still rode the tram like any common worker, ignored by the very institution that should have placed medals on his chest. But something subtle began to shift. People who once passed him without noticing now looked twice. Young students approached him with notebooks. Journalists visited him to record his memories. Sailors saluted him quietly, almost secretly, with the respect their superiors never granted him. And Joe, humble and unassuming, responded the same way he always had, with calmness, with truth, with dignity. He never embellished the story. He never spoke with hatred. He never sought revenge or recognition. He simply told what happened exactly as it happened. And that honesty, delivered in the soft voice of an old fisherman whose life had been shaped by storms, resonated more than any speech could. By the 1960s, Brazil was undergoing deep political turbulence, and discussions about democracy, oppression, and human rights brought Joe's story back into the spotlight. His name began appearing in public debates. His testimony began circulating among intellectuals. His role in history became undeniable. And yet, Joe remained poor. He lived modestly, carrying the weight of everything he had seen, everything he had lost, everything he had endured. But for the first time, he was not alone in his memory. Brazil was beginning to remember with him. His life had been spent in silence, but now that silence was breaking, the injustice committed against him was becoming part of the national conversation. The truth was finally becoming too large to hide, and as the country awakened, slowly, painfully, to the reality of its past, Joe witnessed something he had never seen before, a nation beginning to honor him, not with medals, not with ranks, not with positions, but with truth. The truth he had carried alone for so long, the truth he had refused to bury, the truth that would, at last, allow his story to live beyond him. He was becoming what the oppressed rarely become in their own lifetimes, a hero, not by decree, not by ceremony, but by the collective conscience of a country finally ready to face itself. The man who had once been pushed into obscurity was rising, slowly, steadily, into the light. As Brazil moved through the turbulence of the mid-20th century, dictatorships rising and falling, new political movements reshaping the nation's identity, the story of João Cândido began to feel less like a historical footnote and more like a mirror the country could no longer avoid. A mirror reflecting its deepest contradictions, its wounds, its silences, its ghosts. João himself, though aging and worn by decades of hardship, remained steadfast. He had lost almost everything a man can lose: family, career, recognition, stability, yet his dignity, That quiet dignity that had set him apart from the beginning remained untouched. He still woke early, still sold fish at the market, still greeted people with the politeness of someone who had once stood tall on a warship's deck, still spoke little, observed much. But now the world around him was slowly changing. The whispers had grown into conversations, the conversations into research, the research into public debate, and public debate into a slow, steady demand. Brazil must acknowledge what it did to this man. Institutions, however, do not move with the same speed as conscience. While historians and activists resurrected Joe's name with pride, the Navy remained silent, the same cold, institutional silence that had followed him since the day he walked out of its gates, stripped of uniform, rank, and future. The Navy could modernize its ships, it could change its doctrines, its policies, its uniforms, but it could not change the past. And the past, now illuminated by the stories pouring from archives and Joe's own voice, stood as a stark indictment. To acknowledge Joe would mean acknowledging the brutality, the racism, the betrayal, the murder of 16 sailors in a sealed cell, the torture, the lies, the false amnesty, the decades of humiliation inflicted on a man who had led with more honor than most officers of his time. Institutions rarely confess willingly, but truth has a rhythm of its own, slow, patient, inevitable. As Brazil embraced democracy once more and people reclaimed their right to question, to investigate, to unveil the hidden chapters of their history, Joe became an emblem of everything the country needed to confront. He had become a figure too large for silence. While the Navy avoided the topic, others stepped in. Human rights groups invoked his name. Educational programs highlighted the revolt. Cultural movements chanted his story. Black activists recognized him as an early warrior against institutionalized racism. Students carried his image in marches, painted on banners, printed on shirts, drawn in murals across city walls. It was through these movements from the people, not the government, that Joe's story reached new generations. And the more people learned, the clearer it became that Joe's struggle was not just historical, it was contemporary, it was alive. It was the struggle of millions of Brazilians still fighting for dignity in the face of power. To speak of Joe was to speak of the violence that lingers in systems built on inequality. To speak of Joe was to speak of the scars left by a nation that abolished slavery but never abolished its mentality. To speak of Joe was to speak of every worker who suffers in silence, of every black man targeted by prejudice, of every voice ignored by institutions that claim to serve the people. Joe had lived through all of that and survived with grace. His survival alone was a form of testimony.
But time, while it can bring justice, never stops its relentless march. With every year that passed, Joe grew a little thinner, a little slower, a little weaker. His hands trembled more, and his voice became softer. The weight of nearly 90 years of life was pressing down on him. Yet, as his body grew frail, his story grew more powerful. People would travel from far and wide just for the chance to meet him. Some even called him a hero. He would always shake his head gently, as if brushing away praise he felt he hadn't earned. In his own mind, he wasn't a hero. He had simply refused to accept cruelty. But history doesn't care much for modesty. In the eyes of the new Brazil emerging around him, Joe was becoming something incredibly rare, a living symbol of moral courage. By the 1960s, a chorus of voices demanded that the government officially restore his honor. But institutions are slow to move, especially when it means admitting they were wrong. Still, the pressure built. The people, scholars, artists, and entire movements insisted, and slowly the state began to bend.
It started with honors in local communities. Schools organized events in his name. Graduate students wrote theses about him. Plays dramatized the revolt with Joe as the moral center. Songs turned him into melody, into poetry, into rhythm. His stories spread through radio shows, neighborhood gatherings, schools, cultural centers. While the Navy remained largely silent, the Brazilian people were shouting what the institution refused to say. João Cândido Felisberto was right, and the nation was wrong. And so the tension grew between silence and truth, between the institution and the people, between the past and the present. All the while, Joe lived quietly in his modest home in São João de Meriti, watching as his story, once buried, began to take flight beyond anything he could have imagined. He saw the rise of a new generation that did not fear the truth, a generation that saw in him a model of what resistance looks like when it is carried with dignity rather than anger. He saw young activists fighting for rights he had never enjoyed. He saw debates about racism that had never existed when he was young. He saw artists celebrating his courage in ways the Navy never would, and in those final years, something remarkable happened. Joe realized he was no longer alone. The story that had been silenced was now being lifted by countless voices, voices that refused to let him fade again, voices that saw him not as a relic, but as a guide, voices that recognized that his fight, the fight for dignity, is the fight that defines a nation. And though he never regained his uniform, never stood on the deck of a battleship again, never received the honors he deserved in life, he saw the beginning of justice. Not full justice that would come decades later, but enough justice for an old man to understand that his life had meaning far beyond the suffering he endured. Enough justice for him to leave this world, knowing that Brazil had begun, finally, to remember. By the time Brazil entered the 1970s, João Cândido Felisberto was near the end of his life. He was no longer the strong young helmsman who had steered the most powerful warships in South America. He was an old man with trembling hands, a thin frame, and eyes that carried the weight of nearly a century of struggle. But if his body had weakened, his story had never been stronger. It flowed now through universities, theaters, samba schools, books, newspapers, and the streets of black communities across Rio de Janeiro. A narrative once suffocated by the Navy was now breathing freely, carried by the very people whose ancestors had suffered the same violence Joe had risen against. To the Navy, he had been an inconvenient memory. To the state, he had been a man best forgotten. To elites, he had been a threat. But to the people, especially the poor and black, he had become something else entirely. A symbol of courage, a reminder that dignity can survive even in the harshest conditions, a testimony that injustice, no matter how powerful, cannot bury the truth forever. It was in these final years that Joe began to hear, sometimes timidly, sometimes boldly, the recognition that had been denied to him for so long. Students approached him not with fear, but with reverence. Poets recited verses inspired by him. Musicians composed sambas celebrating his legacy. Historians called him a pioneer. Activists called him a hero. Children pointed to him as an example of bravery. For the first time, Joe realized that the silence imposed upon him was ending, not because the Navy wanted it to end, but because the country needed it to. A nation that refuses to confront its injustices eventually collapses under the weight of its own lies, and Brazil, pushed by the voices of its people, was beginning to confront one of its oldest lies. The lie that the revolt of the Lash was an act of indiscipline, rather than a cry for humanity. The truth was finally too loud to ignore, and Joe lived just long enough to witness the start of his own resurrection. In 1969, the same year Brazil walked under the shadow of dictatorship, Joe passed away quietly in snow. Joe de Moretti, far from the sea that had shaped him. There were no military honors, no state funeral, no flags at half-mast, no speeches from admirals or presidents. He died the way he had lived since the revolt, humbly, invisibly, without the recognition he deserved. He was buried in the Bexita Fluminense, not in a place of national honor, but in the simple ground of the people he had always belonged to. Yet death did not silence him. If anything, it amplified his voice. Because stories have a way of growing stronger when the body is gone. And Joe's story, liberated from the constraints of his lifetime, began to fly. His death sparked renewed interest in the injustice he endured. Journalists who had hesitated to investigate while he lived now wrote boldly about the brutality of the Navy's repression. Historians who had once feared institutional backlash began publishing the truth with academic rigor. Writers documented the revolt in books that became cultural landmarks. Samba schools turned his life into music. Movements for racial equality embraced his name as a banner. And the same people who had suffered, struggled, and resisted alongside him through generations, claimed him not just as a hero, but as one of their greatest ancestors. His life began to symbolize a deeper, more painful truth about Brazil, that the nation had been built not only by those in power, but also by those who resisted power in silence. That the dignity of a country rests not on its monuments or institutions, but on the courage of men and women who refuse injustice. And Joe had refused injustice in a way so profound, so disciplined, so morally unshakable, that it would take decades for the nation to fully understand him. His death did not mark the end of his story, it marked the beginning of his immortality. Only a year after he passed, historians, artists, and activists intensified their efforts to restore his name. Public debates strengthened, documentaries began to circulate. Schools introduced his story to new generations. In cultural circuits, he became known as a warrior of dignity. In academic spaces, he was recognized as an early voice of human rights. And in the Navy, though still reluctant, whispers of reconsideration began to appear. Slowly, Joe's memory transformed from a hidden injustice into a symbol of national conscience. He had lived without honors, but his legacy now demanded them. He had lived without justice, but history now insisted on it. He had died without recognition, But his name now rose from the shadows with undeniable force, and this rising steady, unbreakable would soon lead to the long overdue moment. The moment when Brazil, after nearly a century of silence, would finally acknowledge that the humble son of former enslaved parents, the fisherman, the helmsman, the rebel the Navy tried to destroy, was, in truth, one of the greatest heroes the nation had ever produced. His story was no longer just history. It was destiny. It was identity. It was truth. After Joe's death in 1969, Brazil stood at a crossroads, though few understood it at the time. The man who had lived and died in poverty, ignored by the institutions that should have honored him, had left behind something far more powerful than a body. He had left behind a truth that refused to be buried, and that truth began to spread. In the 1970s, as the country moved under the heavy silence of dictatorship, academics, artists, and activists kept Joe's memory alive in the only way they could, through culture. Through books that circulated hand to hand, through plays staged in small theaters, through songs whispered in samba circles, through research quietly preserved in university archives. Even under censorship, Joe's story resonated. Not because it was political, though it was. Not because it challenged authority, though it did. But because it spoke to something deeper, the perpetual struggle for dignity in a nation built on inequality. As Brazil approached the 1980s and the fight for democracy intensified, Joe's story emerged with new force. Students marched with posters showing his face. Activists wrote manifestos using his name as a symbol of resistance. Black movements embraced him as one of the most important figures in the long battle against institutional racism. Intellectuals declared that no study of Brazilian society was complete without understanding the revolt he led. A man who had lived half his life in silence was now echoing across generations. The pressure mounted. Brazil was changing, but it could not fully change without confronting its past. The country was rewriting its history, and in that rewriting Joe became unavoidable. His name reappeared everywhere in discussions about racial justice, in debates about military abuse, in the academic field of human rights, in the study of post-abolition inequality, in the cultural movement that sought to restore the place of Afro-Brazilian heroes in national memory. The Navy could remain silent, but Brazil no longer would. Foot by foot, the nation approached a necessary reckoning. Joe's life was not a simple historical curiosity. It was a key to understanding the country's structure, its wounds, its contradictions, its unfinished battles. Why does a nation that abolished slavery still rely on violent discipline? Why are the poor always expected to remain silent? Why is bravery punished when it comes from those without privilege? Why does power fear dignity more than rebellion? Joe's story forced these questions into daylight. He became a reference point in discussions about racial inequality, institutional violence, social mobility, the politics of memory, the ethics of resistance, the human cost of silence. He was no longer just a sailor who led a revolt. He became a prism through which Brazil examined itself. And as Brazil transitioned from dictatorship to democracy, the urgency to confront forgotten heroes grew stronger. A nation cannot be whole if it forgets those who gave everything for justice. A nation cannot be honest if it only celebrates victories won by the powerful. A nation cannot heal if it hides its own cruelty. And Joe's story contained all these contradictions, became the perfect lens through which Brazil finally began to understand itself. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, cultural and academic movements gained national space. Books about the revolt of the Lash started reaching a wide audience. Musicians incorporated Joe's name into their lyrics. Journalists investigated the Navy's role with unprecedented boldness. Television programs highlighted the injustice he suffered, and young historians, armed with access to previously hidden archives, began to publish the truths that institutions had rejected for decades. Every new discovery strengthened Joe's legacy. Every uncovered document exposed the cruelty he endured. Every testimony reinforcing his calm leadership contradicted the false narrative that once painted him as unstable or dangerous. Slowly, Joe's story became not just a matter of memory but a matter of justice. Communities that had long lived with the scars of inequality now saw Joe as proof that their struggles were neither isolated nor imaginary. He became part of a broader narrative, the story of black resistance in Brazil. And in that narrative, Joe was a giant, the son of former enslaved parents who dared to demand dignity in the heart of a military institution, the man who commanded battleships but refused to fire on civilians, the leader who faced the Navy not with violence but with conscience, the survivor who endured torture that would have broken most men, the forgotten hero who lived and died in poverty, the symbol resurrected by a country finally ready to see him. As the 1990s approached, a movement grew with a single mission: restore João Cândido to the place in history from which he was violently removed. Activists demanded public recognition. Scholars pushed for inclusion in school curricula. Cultural groups called for official memorials. Politicians, some sincerely, others opportunistically, began to speak his name again. And by the turn of the century, Joe's truth was no longer contested. The evidence was overwhelming. The voices demanding recognition were too many. The silence of the Navy, too loud to ignore. A new question replaced the old ones. When will Brazil formally honor its most silenced hero? That question would lead to one of the most profound moments in the country's historical reckoning, a moment where truth long suppressed would finally break through the surface. But before that moment arrived, another transformation took place. Joe's story, once marginal, had become central. He was now the heartbeat of discussions about justice, the compass guiding the rewriting of history, the symbol reminding Brazil that a country is not defined by those it celebrates, but by those it silences. And Joe had been silenced for far too long. The stage was set. The truth was undeniable. The demands were loud. The country was ready. All that remained was the overdue act of recognition, the moment when Brazil would finally stop running from its past and turn toward the man who had always been waiting in the shadows. As Brazil moved into the final decades of the 20th century, the momentum around João Cândido's memory grew with a force that no institution could contain. What had begun as a quiet cultural awakening had become a national debate, a confrontation between a country as sanitized history and the truth that pulsed beneath it. For nearly 100 years, the official narrative had portrayed the revolt of the Lash as a moment of insubordination, a stain on the Navy's honor. But now, the country was asking whose honor had truly been stained. The Navy's silence, once powerful, was losing its strength. Truth had taken root too deeply in the public conscience, and while institutions can resist facts, they cannot resist the will of an entire people awakening at once. Brazil was finally beginning to understand what João had seen so clearly in 1910, that cruelty disguised as discipline does not make an institution strong, it makes it hollow. That authority built on violence is not authority, it is fear, and that dignity, once awakened, becomes a force no power can extinguish. In the 1990s and 2000s, as democratic institutions stabilized and the country looked back at its past with new eyes, demands for justice intensified. Activists, scholars, artists, and ordinary citizens all repeated the same truth: a country cannot move forward while denying the courage of those it betrayed. Joe's name became central in this new national conversation. He appeared in textbooks, academic journals, TV specials, museum exhibits. Children learned not only about the revolt but also about the brutality of the punishments abolished because of it. They learned about the 16 men who died in the sealed cell. They learned about the false amnesty. They learned about the torture Joe survived. And they learned about the decades of silence he endured. In classrooms, teachers asked questions that generations before them had been discouraged from asking. Why was Joe erased? Why was the Navy allowed to silence him? What does justice look like a century later? Students debated, historians answered, communities reflected. And slowly, the country's relationship with its own past shifted. What had once been a forbidden story was now becoming a shared one. And the pressure reached Brazilian congressional hearings. Politicians, some genuinely committed, others simply aware of the shift in public sentiment, spoke Joe's name with a reverence that would have been unthinkable in earlier decades. They read statements honoring the bravery of the sailors. They acknowledged the cruelty of the punishments. They admitted that the revolt had been, at its core, a demand for basic human rights. The Navy watched in silence. But the silence was no longer power. It was admission. And then, in 2008, something occurred that Joe, in life, could never have imagined. A bill was introduced in the Brazilian Congress to include his name in the book of heroes and heroines of the nation, a sacred space reserved for those who fundamentally shaped Brazil's identity. The debate was intense. Some opposed the idea, not because Joe was unworthy, but because acknowledging him meant acknowledging the Navy's shame. It meant admitting that the institution, celebrated for its tradition and discipline, had failed morally in 1910. It meant confronting the violence that continued long after the revolt ended. But truth had waited long enough. The bill passed. Nearly all parties voted in favor. It was a moment of collective reckoning, rare, profound, almost sacred. The son of former enslaved parents, the fisherman who died in poverty, the helmsman the Navy tried to erase, the survivor of torture, the leader who refused to fire a single shot. This man was now officially a hero of Brazil. A century after being expelled from the Navy in disgrace, João Cândido Felisberto returned to the nation's highest temple of memory as a symbol of dignity, courage, and justice. And something even more extraordinary happened for the first time. Members of the Brazilian Navy participated in a ceremony honoring him. It was subtle, quiet, cautious, but it was real. A recognition that could not undo the past, but that set the beginning of a new relationship between the institution and its own truth. In that moment, Brazil did something that few nations have the courage to do. It honored the man who held up a mirror to its cruelty. And in doing so, something shifted deep within the country's conscience. People no longer saw Joe as a rebel but as a moral anchor. Not as a mutineer but as a guide, not as a forgotten sailor but as a national symbol of resistance to injustice. And Joe's legacy expanded once more. Schools organized projects in his name, communities built memorials, artists created paintings, sculptures, songs, samba schools dedicated entire parades to his life, watched by millions across the world. Activists invoked him in debates about racial equality and military reform. And through all of this, a profound realization emerged. Brazil did not simply remember João. Brazil needed João, needed his story to teach the next generations, needed his courage to inspire new battles for justice, needed his voice, the voice that never shouted, never threatened, never surrendered, to remind the nation that dignity is the most powerful form of resistance. By the time Joe's story reached the dawn of the new century, he was no longer a footnote. He was a foundation, a reminder that history is not shaped only by those in power, but by those who, even in silence, refuse to kneel. A reminder that truth endures, that justice may be delayed, but cannot be denied forever, that the oppressed often carry the moral strength that the powerful lack, and that sometimes the greatest heroes are those the world tries hardest to forget. João had lived with nothing. He had died with nothing, but he left Brazil with everything it needed to confront its own conscience. And as the country marched into the 21st century, one thing had become unmistakably clear. His story had not ended. It had only begun to rise. By the time Brazil finally inscribed João Cândido's name into the book of heroes and heroines of the nation, the tides of history had already turned irreversibly in his favor. No longer a ghost wandering the edges of national memory, he now stood at the center of Brazil's moral conscience, not because institutions chose him, but because the people refused to forget him. The recognition was monumental, but the truth is that Joe's legacy had already surpassed any official title, any congressional vote, any ceremony in Brasilia. He had entered a different realm, the realm of ancestors, the realm of eternal symbols, the realm of lives that become lessons for generations. And in this realm no institution could touch him. As Brazil looked back at the revolt of the Lash with honest eyes for the first time, something profound happened. The country began to understand that Joe's story was not just about the Navy, or about 1910, or even about racism and oppression. It was about the soul of a nation that has often struggled with its contradictions between freedom and inequality, between democracy and authoritarianism, between memory and silence. Joe's life illuminated these contradictions with painful clarity. He had risen from a world still scarred by slavery. He had demanded dignity in the belly of an institution built on hierarchy and violence. He had survived the machinery of repression designed to crush men like him. He had endured poverty, invisibility, and grief that would have broken nearly anyone else. And yet, he never surrendered his humanity. That humanity is what makes him eternal. It is why scholars still revisit the revolt with awe, why samba schools still turn his story into rhythm and color, why children in classrooms speak his name with pride, why movements for racial justice invoke him as a guiding figure, why monuments rise in his honor across Rio de Janeiro, São Paulo, Brasilia, Pelotas, and beyond. Because João represents something bigger than an event in 1910. He represents the constant, unyielding struggle of those who demand dignity in a world determined to deny it. He is not just part of Brazil's past, he is part of its future. In the years following his recognition as a national hero, Joe's name became a compass for those who advocate equality within institutions. His story is used in naval academies to discuss ethics and leadership. Human rights groups cite him as an example of peaceful resistance. Academics analyze him as a pivotal figure in the fight against structural racism in Brazil. And ordinary people, especially the black, the poor, the marginalized, see in him a reflection of their own journeys. Because Joe's victory was not a victory of force, it was a victory of character. He held the power of cannon fire in his hands and chose not to use it. He faced torture without responding with hate. He carried injustice without allowing it to deform him. This restraint, this moral clarity is what separates rebels from heroes. The Navy had always feared that acknowledging Joe would weaken the institution, but in truth, acknowledging him made the institution stronger. It allowed the Navy to confront the darkest parts of its history and finally begin to grow beyond them. A country becomes mature not when it hides its past, but when it learns from it. And Joe forced Brazil to learn. By acknowledging him, Brazil acknowledged the millions of black lives exploited after abolition. The workers silenced, the sailors punished, the poor humiliated, the people forgotten. He became not only a symbol of resistance, but a symbol of the Brazil that has always existed beneath the official narratives. The Brazil of dignity, the Brazil of struggle, the Brazil of courage, the Brazil of conscience. Over time, statues were raised, streets renamed, films produced, books written, murals painted. But perhaps the greatest monument to João is invisible. It is the shift in national consciousness. A new generation now grows up knowing that one of Brazil's greatest heroes was a black sailor born to the children of enslaved parents who fought not for power but simply to be treated as a human being. This truth, planted deep within the country's memory, will continue to grow long after all physical monuments fade. And so, the man who once stood alone at the helm of a massive warship now stands at the helm of something far greater, the moral horizon of a nation. The waves of time cannot erase him. The silence of institutions cannot bury him. The injustice of the past cannot define him. Today, when Brazilians speak the name João Cândido, they do not think of rebellion, they think of dignity. They think of courage. They think of the promise of a more just nation. He is the tide that refuses to recede, the current that shapes the shoreline, the lighthouse guiding the future, the voice that echoes even in silence. And now, more than a century after the revolt, his legacy flows through Brazil like the sea that shaped him, relentless, eternal, unbroken. João Cândido Felisberto, the Black Admiral, did not command a fleet for long, but he commands something far more powerful today. He commands the conscience of Brazil. And as long as there is injustice to confront, as long as there are voices to raise, as long as the sea continues to touch the shores of the nation he loved, his story will continue to rise again and again like a wave that refuses to die.